I'm asked periodically, can you do a video on polishing? I've done one, but I think it's tucked away in the archives of the channel somewhere. So I thought I'd do another, bring it a bit more up to date. Anything new I've learned, I can bring that on there and perhaps not waffle quite as much as I probably did on the old one. So I'm working on these this leg harness. It's missing a lame in there, but you get the idea. And I thought, well, we'll talk about the polying and planishing that up. So what I've done is I've planished the surface using the hammers. Now you can, quick word about the hammers, you can buy specialist hammers, but for the most part I do most of my planishing with these two. Small one to get inside some of the smaller curves on a slightly dished surface, very slightly, which I've shown quite a few times. And for the surface I tend to use this one over a flattened ball stake, and that works well. Occasionally there's a bit of a curve and I'll use this one. You can buy planishing hammers, you can get hold of them, and they're okay. I haven't used this one in forever. It's dust all across the top, but he's nice when he's needed. Larger surface areas like helmets and so on. But I tend to do most of my planishing from the inside onto the flat surface that way. I find it easier and you end up with less hammer marks. So yeah, assuming it's relatively well planished, and we've got the surface going reasonably well. I can feel across here. I tend to use my thumb more than my forefinger. I don't know why, it just feels I can pick up more of the dinks and dents that are on there, and I can feel that's a bit undulating there, needs a bit of work around here and so on. What I mean by that, if we look at some of the theory behind what we're doing, imagine this is a cross section of a piece of metal, and there it is. So that's about, from there to there, about 1 millimetre, 2 millimetres, whatever it is. And you can see if you passed a grinder or a file across this surface, it's nice and smooth on there, and you won't remove an awful lot of material, and you'll be able to bring that down and get a nice shine. Let's see if that works. Oh, look at that. So imagine though our piece of metal is a bit more undulating. There we go. So that's the same cross section across there, but this time we've got some of the making marks where we've been hammering and so on. Now you can file that back relatively easily. You just take a file across and you've got to go to the lowest points. And what you can end up with, there's one there, I didn't really draw this very well, another one there, you end up with areas of the material that you've thinned quite badly. And you might have started with, say, I don't know, 16 gauge, 1.6 mil, and by the time you've ground it back you'll end up with a piece that's about 1 mil thick quite easily. You've only got to have, oh, dropped your chalk, instead of having something undulating like that, you've only got to have missed shot with the hammer and stuck a crescent in there, which might look like that when you're actually on the surface there, and then to file that back and keep it reasonably smooth, you could be down to less than 0.5 mil in this area. So it'll look nice and solid from the front, but you've got a weakness in the material there, and you can go through it. I've done that in the early days a couple of times, particularly on, I haven't got anything on the desk, but particularly on points and stuff like that, on cooters and so on, you blow through the underside of it by accident. So our planishing then, well, the first part is try not to beat the living hell out of it too much whilst you're making it, or start with a material that's thick enough to allow you to do that. There is a train of thought that's championed by a couple of folk, it's totally legitimate as far as I can tell, that they would have started with very thick material and then just ground the hell out of it. You can see it, it's evident, but nowadays we tend to have sort of, you know, 16 gauge, 14 gauge and so on. So imagine you've got your piece and we've got a few knocks and bits and pieces in it. So that's it made, there's our cross section. Now the first bit, what we're going to be looking to do is trying to smooth these out. But imagine if I've struck hard there with the hammer during the making process and it was floating around, it wasn't on a hard anvil surface. What I've done is I've shunted the whole width of that material that way. So what I can do is I can push that back that way as I'm hammering. So hence you hammer from the inside and you smooth that across a bit. On some marks, like say this one here, where it's just a misstruck hammer blow, like that for example, has gone in and marked the surface, you've got to make a choice. There's no real movement on this bit, so if I push that way, I can smooth it a bit and keep that tidier at the front, but I have thinned the material, so you have to be aware of that. And I think there comes a point, if you look at a lot of original pieces, you can see little crescent shapes and corners of hammers and so on, because they dented the material, but they didn't push it out. They didn't feel the necessity to have, excuse me, a machined finished look to the piece. I'm just looking around, here we go, this will do. So, you know, just a modern piece of engineering. When I bought this new from the shop, was perfectly smooth. And we expect to see that now. But back in medieval ages and so on, the aesthetic didn't exist. Anyway, I'm looking for everything. Look, there goes a piece of metal. Absolutely wonderfully machined and perfectly smooth. No hammer marks or anything like that. Whereas you look at a lot of armour, they made those choices. If there was a dent there that is just literally a chip from a hammer, very often they seem to have left it, particularly on thinner areas of the body, of the armour, sorry. So you have to make a choice. I think they look good with those marks in because it's clearly handmade and looks much more like the original, but some people like things to be absolutely glistening. So a way of pushing those back is to strike from the inside onto a hard surface, and eventually you'll do that, but at the sacrifice of a little bit of width across the back. So the planishing then with the hammers, or hammer polishing I've heard it called, is trying to get you to a point where that movement is very slight. Now the inside can be like a bit of chocolate pudding, and often is, depending on how you do your planishing, but you want to just lift out most of the mess so that when you then come to start grinding, you can get an aggressive grinding disc like an 80 or even a 60 grit disc, but you pass it gently across, and what it will reveal to you is the slightly smaller bits, if I can demonstrate this, where perhaps it's just a slight bit like that, and it'll show that movement there, and you can make the decision then, is it small enough just to quickly nip off the 2 points and make it nice and smooth, or do you hit it back from underneath? So that's sort of where I'm at with this. I've done a good bit of sight. I can feel there's a few on there which I would probably fetch out, but I'm going to leave on so that when I pass the grinder across they'll reveal themselves and we can make some decisions on them for the video. And you can see there some work marks, possibly where it was on a form sort of striking. I was a bit careless and it's put those in, so we'll have to look to see what we do about those. So what I'm going to do next is change my grinder. Now some folk have slack belt linishers. I'd love to have one, but I don't have one at the moment, so I'm stuck with a flexible sanding disc. You can get these, they're a couple of £1 normally, and they've got a little bit of flex to them. If I do it there you go. A little bit of flex, so if you're pushing, you're not gouging lines into it, but you shouldn't be pushing that hard on armour anyway. You should just be touching it across. For years and years I used similar thing, but it's rigid. See, I can't get that to flex, and I didn't mark the material because you're not pushing that hard. Okay, so it's just for feathering that off. So what I'll do is I'll pass that across the whole surface, and then we'll take a look at where we are. There we go. And what I've done is I've just touched it across the surface there. You can see that, I hope, in the video. Yeah, there we go. So there's the original surface, and there's my first pass. Now, a couple of things. When you're using this sort of device, when you're using a grinder for this rather than a slack belt linisher, you've got to think of the way that you're going to put the grain of the scratches in. Because I use a flap wheel as well, it doesn't have the strength of, say, a slack belt linisher, that sort of thing, to create a nice surface, and you get these scratches. And if you end up then going in the opposite direction to those, you can end up having to really reduce the material to lift all of the scratches out rather than running with the grain. and just they come out so much easier. So think about that if you do use this technique. But anyway, you can see here what it's done is it's revealed a couple of spots for me. You can see just there, look in the light, if I catch that right, there we go. So I can even feel that with my hand. Remember I said at the beginning I can feel a few bits and pieces. And here, look, where I've put the crease in, you can see a dark line there where I haven't brought that forward well enough. So I'm faced with a choice here, like we were looking at the diagrams at the beginning. I can grind away the two higher bits of the material so you get down to that to lift it out. Or I can give that a tap back on the inside, planish it forwards and sort it out. Now if I do that here, I've got to be careful I don't change the shape here for the lane. It's just something you've got to deal with when you get to it. But I can see that's a fairly gentle thing that shouldn't attack the outside shape there too much. Some of these smaller ones, so like right here on the edge, look, there's been very little movement of this material at all. And obviously just when I've been striking it, I've hit a bit hard here. And I've put a dent in just there, and that's not really structural. So it'll serve as a purpose, as an example for this here. What I'll do is I'll get my gear back on and I'll just fetch that out using the grinder. I don't really want to do that across the middle here because I just don't want to attack the thickness of it there. But I can see that it's tiny little bit. So rather than go through a lot of ribbon, I'll show you can fetch these things out with the grinder first. Yeah, put the eyes on. There we go. So there we go, a couple of light passes, and I've fetched most of it out, and there's still a little mark there in the middle, which I'm not too fussed about, to be honest. A little one like that every now and then looks nice, it shows that it's handmade, and also it's more than likely going to be in a roundabout where my rivet's going to go for the buckle that's going to sit off there. This isn't the one I'll be using, but you get the idea. I'll have one of those about there, and the rivet head will come up. But you can see how you can fetch it out relatively easily on areas where it's not too important. I'd have to get a measure in to see if I've even thinned that. Obviously I have, but I'd have to check that. But I don't really want to do that here. So it's back to the anvil for that and fetch that forward with a few strikes, and along here where I've got the more gentle movement there. So we'll get those fetched out and then we'll do another pass and we'll see if we're satisfied. So there we go, we can see from this, take that stuff off, that's nice and sharp now, pleased with that. There's a couple of surface ones here, remember right at the beginning I was saying about some strike marks, and to be honest I'll fetch those off from the front over on the ball stake. So I'll get the ball stake underneath and we'll just give those a few strikes just to planish that out and then lift those little bits out. You can see how we got rid of most of that there. So all in all pretty good. I'm just going to fetch these out on the ball stake and then we'll move on to the next part of the process. So I'm back from the ball stake. You can probably pick up some of the bruising on the metal there, just to try and fetch out these smaller marks. Whether they come out or not now, that's what I'm trying to say, I'm not too bothered about. I'll get 60-70% of them. There'll be a couple of little pits left. That's perfect, I feel, for the era that we're depicting here. So I'm going to go over those and then we will move on to the grinder just over there.